This video will be an introduction to p5.play. I'll be covering a few different things. First, just basically what p5.play is, how to import the library into the p5.js web editor, and then how to create a sprite. So p5.play is a simple 2D game engine based on p5.js, which is a JavaScript library for creative coding, with a focus on making code and code creation easy and accessible and inclusive for artists, educators, and beginners. So p5.js is a great place to start learning programming, and p5.play is a great place to build on that knowledge and start making games and learning about game engines. So how do you use it? Well, p5play.org has a bunch of resources, is the website, and has a bunch of resources for learning how to use the library. The best I've found is under Learn, where it goes through and highlights the kind of core functionality in different categories, using sprites, something called sprite groups, animation, adding animation to your sprites, getting input both from the keyboard and mouse and a controller potentially, tile mapping, and using the camera. So one thing to note is that each one of these categories has a bunch of pages at the bottom here, so I encourage you to kind of click through and explore that way. All right, so how do we use it? How do we write code with it? The easiest way is just to use the p5.js web editor, which hopefully you are familiar with if you've used p5.js before, editor.p5js.org. And the problem is, by default, the library is not installed in this editor. So you have to import the code for the p5play library somehow. Two ways to do this. One, you can just click on this link from the homepage, p5play, and it will open up a pre-built project with the libraries already included. But it has a bunch of code and comments, so it can be a little bit annoying to have to delete everything every time. But you could just kind of start from here and save your own projects and get started that way. The other way is to include the libraries manually. And the way to do that is also on the website. You can see under local development, there are a number of script tags here. And the first two are essential for using p5.js, so they should already be included in the web editor. And so all we really need are these last two here. And if I copy these last two, I can then paste them into our p5 editor, this default project that we have here. And the way to do that is clicking this arrow in the top left, which reveals a number of additional files that are needed for your p5.js scripts to run. We've got this script, by default, the sketch.js file is highlighted, which should look familiar to you. But also there's this index.html file, and these are kind of the tags that you need to include and to use the p5.js library. And if we want to add the p5play, we can just paste the additional two script tags after the two that we need for p5.js that are already included. So I'll just paste these here. And so now that we have these two script tags, we can save this. I'm going to just call this p5 intro demo. And then collapse this after selecting sketch.js. We can collapse this and start working. Now we have built in all of the code and functions and objects and everything associated with the p5play library. To get started, I would suggest, again, exploring sprites. And so this is kind of the most basic way to create a sprite. So it shows you that you can create a variable to hold your sprite and then use this new command, new sprite, constructor, kind of behind the scenes, creating a sprite for you. And then you can start playing around with changing parameters of that object that you've just created with that sprite. So let's try it. I'm going to create let's say, player sprite here, but player sprite. I'm just going to create a variable, just assuming that this could be a player in our game. And I'll say player sprite equals new sprite. And say, let's put it in the center of the screen. Since we have a canvas of 400 by 400, we'll put it at 200 by 200. and give it a diameter of 50. Now, here we can see our sprite has been created. Note that it kind of does things a different way here. It sets the parameters and doesn't put them in the constructor. Either way is fine. So you could actually go and use this syntax and say sprite dot x equals 200, player sprite dot y equals 200, and the player sprite dot diameter equals 50, and this will essentially do the same thing as what we had before. You will notice that each time you run the program, it gives you a different color for the sprite. If you do not give it a color, it'll just give you a random one by default. But let's just go back, and since this is I'll undo those changes, since it's a little bit faster way of doing things. Also note that if you pass in 4 parameters, the fourth and fifth will then be the width and the height of a rectangle. So you can just control whether or not you want squares or rectangles. Now, one thing that's really important to point out here is this is different from p5.js, right? So if we notice that we're creating this player sprite in setup, which is important because we only want to create one of them. If we were to put this player sprite into draw, what actually would be happening, and you can see this since it gives you a random one each time, it's creating a sprite every frame. So you're getting tons and tons of sprites, which is unnecessary and is going to start performing poorly. You only really want one, and then manipulate that one and move it across the screen and do things that you required for your game. Now, another kind of way of pointing out the difference here is, let's think about how we would draw a circle normally in p5.play. And if we were to kind of do the same thing, instead of using this new sprite code, just draw a circle to the screen using the p5.js code for creating a circle, which pretty similar. We have the x and y coordinates and the diameter. And you might expect it to be something similar show up here, but if we run this, we see nothing. And then you might remember, oh yeah, because when we are in p5.js, when we draw to the screen, note that we have this background here. And one of the important things to note when you're starting out is this background actually draws the color that's specified within the parentheses over the entire canvas. So it just covers the whole thing, and anything previous will get overwritten. So we have this circle, and if you kind of run this, you can see there's this flash of the circle that happens once, but then the background continually overwrites that. So why is it the case that this player always gets shown? And this is kind of just the magic when we do it this way, where the circle gets shown. And the magic of this is essentially just the magic of the p5.play library behind the scenes drawing your sprites for you. So whenever you create a sprite, it will automatically then draw that essentially after this draw call behind the scenes. So you don't have to actually explicitly worry about drawing that yourself. 2 other things I'll show you before the end of this video is, one, you can actually explicitly set the color yourself. There is a color parameter, and you can just use the same syntax as you would with passing in RGB values to this color. So in this case, if we want to make it red, we can say 255, 0,0. And then the last thing is, there's a lot of stuff you can do with sprites, the most basic being movement. And just to kind of, again, highlight the difference here, if we wanted to move this sprite, we can say player sprite.speed equals 2. And that's one way to move something. There's a lot of different ways. We'll go over that in different videos. But you can see you can just set the speed once, and then it will just automatically move that without anything else in draw. So it's just a different way of thinking in terms of thinking about your objects as kind of entities that you can set properties for that will kind of last throughout your sketch until you explicitly destroy them or something. So the next video will talk more about movement, different ways to move things, and sprites in p5.play.